Handling of autism and neurodiversity in the 1800s. In the 19th century, the concepts we now recognize as autism or broader neurodiversity were not identified as such. The term autism was not coined until 1911 by Eugene Bleuler to describe a symptom of schizophrenia, referring to extreme self-absorption or withdrawal. Instead, individuals exhibiting autistic traits, such as social withdrawal, repetitive behaviors, sensory sensitivities, or intense fixations, were often categorized under broader stigmatizing labels like idiocy, feeble-mindedness, monomania, obsessive focus on a single idea, or dementia praecox, premature dementia, a precursor to schizophrenia diagnoses. Treatment and societal integration varied by era, influenced by philosophical shifts, wars, and industrialization. Early in the century, approaches were often more community-oriented or experimental, reflecting Enlightenment ideals of humanity and reason. By the late 1800s, institutionalization dominated, with emerging eugenics framing neurodivergence as a societal threat. Early 19th century, broader human displays and humane approaches. At the turn of the 19th century, Romanticism celebrated eccentricity, individualism, and the natural human spirit, leading to a fascination with wild children, or feral cases that sometimes aligned with autistic traits, such as non-verbalism or sensory aversions. These were viewed not just as pathologies but as windows into innate human nature, echoing Rousseau's noble savage ideal. A prime example is Victor of Aveyron, a feral boy discovered in 1798, studied into the 1800s, who displayed non-verbal communication, resistance to touch, and echolalia, repeating sounds. French physician Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard treated him with behavioral interventions to foster social bonds and speech through imitation, marking one of the earliest documented efforts at structured support for such traits. In America, educator Samuel Gridley Howe surveyed intellectually disabled individuals in Massachusetts in 1846, describing cases like Billy, a man with echolalia, savant-like musical memory, recalling 200-plus tunes, and social isolation, behaviors now linked to autism, but who didn't fit the era's idiot stereotype. Howe's work emphasized observation over punishment, advocating for education rather than isolation. This era's moral treatment revolution, pioneered by Philippe Pinel in France, who unchained asylum patients in the 1790s, and spread by figures like William Tuke in England, prioritized kindness, routine, occupational therapy, and psychosocial care in freestanding asylums. It viewed mental differences as treatable through environment and moral discipline, not demonic possession or incurability. Neurodivergent individuals might live with family, work in communities, or be displayed in freak shows as curiosities, reflecting a mix of tolerance and exploitation. Reactions to the Napoleonic Wars and Revolutions of 1848. The Napoleonic Wars, 1799–1815, accelerated medical reforms, including in psychiatry, as battlefield trauma highlighted psychological wounds. French doctors advanced humane care, building on Pinel's work, with asylums adopting moral treatment to rehabilitate soldiers and civilians amid social upheaval. However, post-war conservatism shifted focus from human displays to control, viewing eccentricity as potential unrest. The revolutions of 1848 amplified this, as widespread uprisings across Europe linked political fervor to nervous maladies and hereditary weaknesses. Psychiatrists grew alarmed, associating activism with monomania or induced madness, leading to stricter asylum admissions for those deemed socially disruptive. This marked a pivot from romantic tolerance to medicalized surveillance, with asylums expanding as tools for social order rather than therapy. Impact of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, c. 1760–1840, peaking mid-century, transformed society from agrarian to urban factory life, imposing rigid schedules, sensory overload, and productivity norms that marginalized neurodivergent traits. Urban environments exacerbated sensory issues, for example noise crowds, as noted by sociologist Georg Simmel in 1903, who described city life as overwhelming for sensitive minds, foreshadowing modern autism sensory profiles. Capitalism's emphasis on conformity labeled fixations or social awkwardness as inefficiencies, boosting asylum populations as unfit workers were segregated. This era birthed new diagnoses like stereotypy, repetitive behaviors coined by Jean-Pierre Falret in 1864, and idiot savant, John Langdon Down, 1877, recognizing strengths amid deficits but often pathologizing differences. Famous 19th century figures. Suspected of autism or Asperger's retrospective diagnoses are speculative, based on biographies showing traits like social withdrawal, intense interests, and sensory quirks. Notable examples include Charles Darwin 1809, 1882 childhood isolation, avoidance of eye contact, social interaction, obsessive letter writing for communication, fixations on geology, chemistry. A psychiatrist concluded Asperger's based on these. Emily Dickinson 1886 reclusive lifestyle, rarely left home, unconventional poetry with repetitive themes, preference for children over adults, fascination with scents, flowers, white clothing ritual, featured in books on autistic writers. Lewis Carroll 1832, 1898 severe stammer, poor peer relationships, preference for children, mathematical genius, inventive quirks, traits align with communication and social challenges. Nikola Tesla 1856, 1943 phobias of germs/light/sound, social isolation, obsessions, for example number 3, visionary inventions, records suggest autism. These individuals often channeled traits into genius, thriving in pre-industrial flexibility. Shift from early to late 19th century, institutionalization, eugenics, and trends. Early centuries moral treatment asylums, 1800s, 1850s, aimed at cure through compassion and routine, with smaller facilities and patient labor. By mid-century, overcrowding and custodial care dominated, as wars, revolutions swelled populations and industrialization prioritized containment over therapy. At late 19th century, eugenics, coined by Francis Galton in 1883, weaponized this shift, viewing neurodivergence as hereditary degeneration, threatening societal progress. Feeble-minded individuals, including those with autistic-like traits, faced segregation in asylums, forced sterilizations, U.S. laws from 1907, and immigration bans, contrasting early humanitarianism with pseudoscientific control. This, from human to hazard evolution, reflected broader ableism peaking in the 20th century scientific background. Before Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger, 19th century psychiatry evolved from superstition to classification, laying groundwork for autism's recognition. Key developments. Early classifications, 1800s, Jean-Étienne Esquirol, 1810s, defined monomania, obsessive ideas, capturing autistic fixations. John Langdon Down, 1877, described idiots, savants, and developmental retardation. Emile Kraepelin, 1899, formalized dementia precox, encompassing cognitive disruptions like attention issues. Pre-20th century foundations. Moral treatment emphasized environment over biology, but asylum data fueled categorizations. Early 20th, pre-Kanner/Asperger, Bloiler, 1911, coined autism for schizophrenic withdrawal. Grunya Sukareva, 1926, described schizoid psychopathies in children, social isolation, repetitive behaviors, predating Kanner, 1943, and Asperger, 1944, by decades, though overshadowed by Western narratives. This built a proto-understanding of spectrum-like traits amid broader insanity frameworks. Sigmund Freud's views on autism, or Asperger's Freud, 1856-1939, never directly addressed autism as it wasn't defined, but his psychoanalytic theories profoundly shaped early interpretations, often harmfully. He attributed psychological disorders to unconscious conflicts from early childhood trauma or repressed sexuality, viewing symptoms as defenses against emotional pain rather than innate neurology. This influenced mid-20th century autism experts like Leo Kanner and Bruno Bettelheim, who adapted Freud's ideas into the refrigerator mother myth. Cold, ambitious parents, especially mothers, allegedly caused autism through emotional neglect, akin to concentration camp trauma. Treatments focused on psychoanalysis to unlock repressed bonds, blaming families, and delaying biological research until the 1970s-80s. Freud's legacy thus stigmatized autism as a parenting failure, contrasting modern neurodiversity views.